What crazy and weird stories do you need to tell?
Episode 7.
So, one day back in 2005 I was called to go to a construction site in order to fix a hydraulic hose on the bucket of a Liebherr 962, huge excavator. When I got there, machine bucket were positioned in the hole it was digging, a good 12 feet deep, so I jumped in the hole and fixed the machine and all was good. The operator then started up the machine and drew the arm out of the hole and started doing his checks, at which point the other machine, a Cat BL 300 excavator, half the size of the Liebherr, was started up and the operator then proceeded to fill in the hole. I was still in the hole. 3 buckets of half-inch clear stone, roadside gravel, about a half-ton each, were piled on me before the guy was dragged out of the machine. Turn out he'd been drinking all day on the job. Woke up in the hospital high as a kite. I remember that day vividly. The nurses and everyone around me had such looks of concern on their face. Turns out the only reason I survived is I was wearing a hard hat, and due to myself always having a good posture, the force of the stone dropping on me was directed down through my spinal column instead of snapping me in half like a twig if I were to have been slouching or even slightly bent over. Who would have thought my mother telling me to pull up my pants and stand up straight would save my life one day? In the end I lost 4 centimeters in height, spent 27 months in an electric wheelchair and a couple of years teaching myself to walk again, not to mention my whole life was turned upside down. Although I guess I did get a kind of consolation in the end in the form of a legal registered medical cannabis garden. Anyways, that's my story. When I was 6 or 7, my dad, brothers, and I were camping somewhere in the Sierra Mountains in California. I had to go to the bathroom and walked up to the huge bathrooms that were near the end of the campgrounds, a good 200 yards away from where our site was. I was in the stall trying to go number 2 when I heard a low growl, looked underneath the stall door and a bear cub, and wandered into the bathroom, followed by a big bear and another cub. At this point, I am terrified. I sit quietly and wait to see if they will leave. They make their way by my stall, and towards the other end of the bathroom where another entrance/exit was. I was so scared, I threw the door of my stall open, and ran out of the bathroom with my pants around my knees. I have no idea why I never thought to pull up my pants, but I made it back to our site. When I was a sophomore in college, about 19 or 20, I used to go out for long walks late at night. I'd just walk around, smoke, and enjoy the solitude. One night I'm walking home at like 1 a.m. I went to get some cigarettes at the corner store, and there's this guy in there just yelling at the clerk. I just nunned out of there, didn't need the smokes that bad. To get home I have to walk past the dinky little back parking lot for the store. As I'm walking by, there's the 2 girls back there, and one of them calls to me, "Hey, can you help us? I just want to go home, I'm only 3 blocks away." But fine, I go over there. The girl says, "I need to go inside the store to get my boyfriend, but my friend here is too drunk. Can you watch her while I go inside?" I take a look at the friend, and she is indeed wasted. No, more like Furunkel usurps. And I think, middle of the night, dimly lit parking lot, drunk college girl, big guy, I'm 6 feet 2 inches. This is like one of the assault videos they made us watch at first-year students' orientation, and I'm being cast in the role of the bad guy. Not my favorite idea. So, I say, "Look, why don't you stay here, and I'll go inside and find this guy." She says, "No, he won't listen to you, it has to be me." At which point I flash back to the guy yelling at the store clerk, "She's going in there to get Mr. Psycho." Well, I don't want to deal with Mr. Psycho either, so I say fine, I'll wait with the friend. Soberish girl starts to head inside, then turns and says, "Oh, if you touch her he'll kill you." I'm too flabbergasted to respond too, because I'm doing her a favor and she just threatened me for it. She goes inside, leaving me in drunk wasted pants in the parking lot. I'm still super aware of the appearances, so I'm standing far away from this girl, like 6 feet away. And she is truly drunk, mostly incoherent, doesn't know where she is, doesn't know what's going on, asking where her friends are, that sort of thing. Eventually she gets started on wanting to go home, and I tell her to just wait for her friends. Then she says, "No, you take me home. I want to go home with you, Probably she just wanted to go crash somewhere, but still, I tell her it's a bad idea, a really bad idea. We're going to wait here for your friend who should be any minute now, please for the love of God. But drunk will not take no for an answer. She actually starts coming after me, grabbing at my shirt, literally begging me to take her home. I'm backing up, kind of fending her off, but she grabs the sleeve of my sweater and twists it up in her hand, and now I just can't get away. I'm panicking a little. I don't want to actually hurt her, but she basically attacking me, won't leave me alone, and she's still frantically begging to go home. So right then I heard this piercing scream, help! He's trying to see her. Because of course this is the moment when the other girl came back out of the store, saw a scuffle, and jumped to the obvious conclusion that any sane person who saw the first-year assault video would reach. My eyes bug out, and just as I'm about to say something in my defense, the siren turns on. Whoop with the flashing lights. All eyes to the entrance of the parking lot, where there's a police car, lights flashing, with two guys standing there looking perplexed at this scene. Me, drunk girl, scuffle, girl screaming. Picture going in front of a judge with that setup. I wasn't trying to see anyone, Your Honor. I was just trying to fend off an attack from that 120 pounds, drunken co-ed. Sure, that sounds great. I figure that's it for me. I'm off to prison for a decade or so. FML. Right then I somehow managed to get free from the drunk girl, and I just power walk away, muttering about how they're all crazy. Don't run, it looks suspicious, but do not stop. I actually had to walk past the police officers, and they didn't try to stop me at all, which I realize is because they're not police, they're private security. Probably the clerk called them because of psycho boyfriend inside. And private security can't detain people, they can't do anything but watch me leave, which I do with alacrity. Just leave, go straight home, and tell nobody about it for years because it's just 2. After the fact I wondered what was going on. That drunk chick was so wasted, maybe she'd been roughed and was trying to ask for help? Maybe the other two were kidnapping her? Or maybe she was just drunk and those were actually her friends? In which case, what did her friend tell her in the morning? I left you in the parking lot for 3 minutes and some guy tried to see you? Does she have some odd view of men in general because of that? No way to know, but I kind of wish I did. I recently worked for UPS last year. One of the drivers I was assigned to told me something remarkably interesting about a building, and at first I didn't believe him. He told me that he's been on his route for 6 years and has not once delivered to this one building. Nor has he seen anyone entering or leaving it. The building doesn't look abandoned, though it does look creepy. One day on the route I hopped off the truck and walked towards the building. I noticed that the windows are all new and the blinds are the same for all the apartments. It looked like people were occupying the building. The building's intercom system is located outside the building, so, if you want to get in you have to ring the door buzzers and wait to physically enter rather than entering a small lobby and buzzing in from there. The names appeared to be written with green markers, but the rain somehow seeped through the protective plastic and ran the ink. So, the names are not readable. Anyways, I looked in the first door and saw that the second door to get in was a wooden school door. The kind that you would see at an elementary school and not in a building. I couldn't help myself, so I rang all the doorbells. I waited for about a minute or two and nothing. But as I walked back to the truck I heard a dog barking from the building and a faint voice of a woman say hello. But the scary part was it wasn't from the intercom, it was from a window. I couldn't gain the courage to turn around. Until this day it has bothered me. The building is located in Brooklyn on 78th Street and 16th Avenue. The building address is 1624 78th Set, Brooklyn, New York. I checked online and the building is off the market. I found a list of people's names that supposedly live there, but if that's the case, why don't they receive any packages? A whole building filled with residents. No signs of life, and in this day and age no packages. Not even one? And another thing. I looked it up on websites trulyarealtor.com and apartments.com. Would you believe not one of the sites have a picture of the inside of the apartments? Why would you put an apartment for rent on a website and not display at least one picture? It makes no logical sense. I work in construction. I've had many injuries in the last 10 years. I've dislocated my shoulder. I had carpal tunnel in both wrists. I severely strained a muscle in my back. Recently I was off work cause of 3 bulging discs in my neck. I've had soloed many cuts, burns, punctures and bruises. Nothing I've ever done at work has rated 10 on the pain scale. The strained muscle was an 8, maybe an 8.5. It had me on the floor gasping for breath. The only 10 I ever had was in 10th grade when I had a stomachache. I was in health class. It was just before lunch. My stomach started to hurt. The pain increased. To the point that I passed out. I woke up in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. After some x-rays it was determined that I had a blocked colon. I'm not saying I'm some kind Iron Man with a high pain tolerance, but I don't believe anyone that tells me their pain is at a 10. I'll believe you if you say it was at 10. 10 is debilitating to the point of unconsciousness. A 10 is when your brain says, just shut everything down. Lost my favorite hoodie in an airport. Caught the thief/finder in a different airport wearing it later that day. So, my wife and I just got married and we're leaving Tampa Airport to go on our honeymoon. It was early, and I was hungover and exhausted from the wedding the day before, so I wasn't as aware as I normally am. I wore my favorite hoodie, which has a unique college logo on it, to the airport. I took the hoodie off and set it next to me on a bench at the airport as I waited for my wife to use the restroom. After we boarded the plane, and it was getting ready to take off, I was overcome with sadness upon the realization it was gone. I had that for years and took all my final exams wearing it. Fast forward 8-ish hours. We were in Atlanta Airport for a long layover. Tired, still hungover, and ready to board our plane, I look to my left and see a middle-aged woman wearing my exact hoodie while she appeared to sleep wearing sunglasses on an airport bench. She was also holding 2 other jackets, so I told my wife I was going to investigate. I walked over and sat next to her. She was sleeping. I gently nudged her a few times until she woke. I told her I liked her hoodie and asked where she got it from. She instantly replied, "My husband got this for me, and it's my favorite." I went back to my wife, extremely disappointed but still suspected of this lady. Several minutes later, I approached her again, and said that I had one just like it. She quickly responded, "Well, my husband got me this one, so I promise it's not yours." I'm a child at heart and wrote my initials on the inside tag, so I asked to see it. She said, "Well, I don't want you to be cold so you can have it." She proceeded to take out a bunch of candy wrappers from the front pocket, remove my hoodie, and give it to me. About 20 minutes later we boarded the plane and that thief sat 2 rows in front of us. I still can't believe the odds of a lady stealing my hoodie in one airport, just happening to go to the same next airport as us, and me seeing her wearing my hoodie. Not one I like to tell, but my favorite band growing up was Green Day, still is, and when I was 16 I got tickets to see them. I kind of had this weird feeling that I'd meet them. I put it down to first concert feels or something, and I had a broken wrist at the time so brought a Sharpie in case one of the band members could sign my cast. My grandpa was living with a family in that city during that time. He lived a few hours out of the city, but his job was good and great pay, so he stayed with this family during the week. The mom worked security for a few places, and I met her once and she was badass, cool AF. Cut to a few days after the concert, which was amazing. My grandpa asked how it was and asked if I got to meet Billy Joe like he arranged. My jaw dropped and I said no. He explained he'd organized for this lady to take me backstage since she was working security for Green Day. He then went on to say the night before the concert this badass had a wicked headache so drove herself to the hospital. She didn't want to wake her family. On her way to the hospital, she died when another car hit her head on. It's a weird story but it makes me seem like a jerk for almost meeting my fave band, but the lady passed away. That's why I don't like telling it. R.I.P. badass rocker mum. My dad has always had a tensive relationship with nature. He is a man who enjoys a measure of control and unfortunately nature does not often conform or bend to the will of man. Rather than carefully tend to a section of the garden he would rather concrete it, turning it into a homogeneous plane of gray and straight lines. There are indeed parallels of this behavior in history. When the European settlers arrived in the New World they were noted for their apparent aversion to trees, as demonstrated in the sheer volume of them cut down. Dad's current property bisects the natural habitat of a number of indigenous animals to the British woodland, foxes, and badgers. Despite their protected status, Dad has quietly fought a guerrilla war with both of these animals on a number of fronts. The badgers once made the mistake of revealing an entrance to their burrow within the perimeter of the property. Dad responded to this infraction by pouring motor oil down the hole, then filling it with scrap metal and brick. Soft crying from the badgers could be heard as their brains, that have come to master shoveling of soil and foraging for food, struggled to come to terms with two things: A. What would have caused the collapse of the robust tunnel system, and B. Quite what was this refined petrochemical that had made its way into the sanctity of the den? Fortunately, the badger has not been gifted, and thus burdened, with the prefrontal cortex to comprehend such cruelty. On another occasion Dad decided to take the fight to the fox. He rigged a chicken with wire and connected this to a switch that would administer a deadly electric charge. A fox was tempted by the chicken and as its jaws clamped around the fortuitous find its biological systems were overridden by an unnatural voltage. A high-pitched yelp was its swan song from mortality, and the mechanical function of its reflective eyes were left staring vacantly into the front room from the garden. Its body was then unceremoniously dumped over the back fence and devoured by the badgers. From coercion to consumption, through to electrocution, this final stage of its body being eaten is the only natural and normal thing to have happened to the fox that evening. Since then, Dad has ringed the perimeter of the garden with barbed wire. One sleepy Sunday afternoon the family had gotten together and were relaxing inside. The temperature was sitting at just about freezing and holding steady at 2 degrees centigrade. On this occasion my brother, the star of such spectacles, I don't want any of that horrible greasy English chocolate, and the knife thrown at head saga, was visiting. Mom was pottering in the kitchen, perhaps boiling water to add to some kind of tea or coffee to offer and share. Dad was sitting in his armchair, his feet elevated on the footstool, the signature third world blanket covering his belly with his bare feet exposed from the bottom. Dad only enjoys sheathing his feet in cheap slippers and having them bare also affords him the opportunity to demonstrate a rare flexibility he has, bringing his big toe over his second and using it as a crude approximation to the obscene middle finger gesture. Editor's note: no one knows exactly what Dad's aversion to socks is. I can personally attest to being ridiculed and abused for opting to wear them in the house in my youth. I suspect that during his childhood hardship socks were a precious commodity, a frivolous indulgence, and that any desire for covering one's feet with cloth material could potentially be an indication of latent gay tendencies. As Mum pottered in the kitchen, making both small talk and offers of hospitality, Dad was sat silent, arms folded across his chest, resting upon his belly. In much the same way a snake will stay motionless, its glassy eyes fixated, though seemingly on no discernible focal point, so too will Dad sit and stare. Perhaps on the TV, perhaps in the middle ground as his mind wonders about a hypothetical situation that he can wind himself up over. The analogy with the snake is not just superficial. In both instances of the reptile and its human emulator, a lack of movement should not be confused with indolence, for both can strike in the blink of an eye. On his visits, my brother yearns for the most elusive commodity of all, warm fathering from Dad, and will strike up conversation on all manner of topics to try and coax it from him. My brother gazed out of the back window onto the frigid grass and saw a large fox limping through the garden and seeking refuge by the recycling bin. Concerned for the animal's welfare, and perhaps hoping to create something of a meaningful bond with another human through shared compassion, my brother alerted Dad to the fox's presence. Before he had finished the X sound that followed the stressed vowel in the word fox, Dad had bolted upright from his chair and was barreling to the back door, clapping and making demonic chants. At the age of 80, what we perceive as human years, no one has been able to satisfactorily posit how Dad can propel himself from a near horizontal position to full forward thrust while clapping at the same time. I have my own theories that are bound to as yet unproven mechanics of quantum gravity, but it will require more observation. Compared to Dad's burst of energy, in what would appear to be slow motion, the fox's razor instincts of survival eventually kicked in, and suddenly whatever ailment befell its leg was the least of its concern. It bounded with virility to the back of the garden, Dad's hands shaking with the anticipation as he unlocks the back door. He exits, continuing the clapping and chanting, as the fox, now as nimbly as in its prime, launches itself over the back fence and the barbed wire above it. Rather than be pleased at its ousting from the garden in its most vulnerable state, desperately exercising its will to survive, Dad was fixated on ensuring that at least its most sensitive area was lacerated by the wire. He slowly turns to my brother, the first words he uttered for 15 minutes, and calmly states, "I hope the barbed wire caught its underbelly." Back in my early teens, I was exposed to the idea of the memory palace, or method of loci, wherein an individual crafts a visual representation in their mind of a house/castle/cabin/cave where they store particular memories. Like getting a book off a shelf in your living room, you can project yourself into your memory palace and pull a particular memory you've stored in a particular place there. Such a technique has been shown to drastically improve memory, likely because of the active aspect of maintaining such a memory palace. So, one lets the mind create, but for me there was a problem. No one told me how to turn the process off. What initially started as an exercise to improve my memory turned into the wholesale development of an entire paradox. Now, it's a massive metropolis, populated with millions of people. I can project myself inward, change the season/weather/time at a whim. I can follow an inhabitant from their home, through the park, and wait for a subway. Yes, there's a train schedule in my mind. However, ultimately, I'm an observer in my inner world. I don't control those inhabitants, and they develop factions, and they go to war, and I can't control it. And I think it's evolved into maladaptive daydreaming. At 17 years I moved to Louisville, Kentucky from New Hampshire. I became friends with a guy who owned a barber shop there. I am white, and this shop is black-owned and in an area where most of the customers and all the other barbers were black as well. Relevant. While in the chair, I was talking about how my family name had been prominent in early Louisville days, with my lineage somewhere being responsible for helping start University of Louisville, museums, and other cool things. One of the other barbers heard me say that, and asked what the name was. I told him. His mouth dropped, he stopped cutting, and said, "Hold on." Then he gets his phone out and starts dialing a number. Now I am really nervous. It was possible that somewhere along the way, I had some redneck racists in my family too. I had no idea what to expect. My barber says, "What is going on?" I said I didn't know, but I hope it isn't something terrible. Someone answers the line, and he says, "Mama. You are never going to believe who is in the shop." Now I am captivated. The suspense was killing me, and as I look around the shop, there were 5 or 6 others waiting for a cut. All 4 other chairs and barbers were all stopped, looking, and listening in. Turns out, my family owned his family as slaves in the 1800s. But my family treated them well, and when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, my family gave his family the house my family lived in and moved into another house, because they were the ones who made the house what it was anyway. So, his family owned the house and property outright. They kept the house through the generations, and he grew up in that house. She was in the house on that phone call. I was a bit ashamed, and relieved at the same time. There could never be a bright side to slavery, but it was an interesting twist to a terrible time, as well as being involved in seeing how a few generations were affected by something my family did. It meant a lot to his family. And how random it was to meet him. I was thinking about this smoking hot Spanish actor Elena Anaya I saw in the film Sex and Lucia one day. The next night when a bunch of friends are hanging out, my friend's girlfriend says how great the movie Sex and Lucia is and how we should all see it. I then comment how the actor in it is so hot. Fast forward to the next morning at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, I'm riding the NYC subway somewhere. All of a sudden I see a hot chick and her friend board the train and sit across from me. It was the actor Elena Anaya. My jaw fell to the ground. She had a tour guidebook in her hand. After a bit I thought I had to make sure it was her, so when I tell the story again to my friends they're not like saying I imagined everything. I stood up and walked up to them. Of course everyone on the train was looking at me like a crazy guy approaching two girls. Asked her if she was Elena Anaya, which was confirmed. Said I enjoyed her film. They were just exploring the city early in the morning on a Saturday. She seemed quite happy that someone recognized her. And yes, she's hotter in person. Wanted to ask them out but of course I just got off at my stop on the NR train. Life is weird. This sort of thing happens a lot in NYC. When I was around 18, I basically tried to die as my final act of heroism. My family, friends, and I spent 13 hours heading to Panama City Beach for spring break or whatever, and literally 20 minutes out from the beach I got a flat tire. We do the thing with the spare and head on our way again, except with haste. As we approached the beach, my cousin, one of three, spotted the red flag at the beach with a guy swimming in bacon and said that means the waves will be awesome. We were all too excited to question it, and as soon as we set foot into the sand 5 out of 8 of us sprinted toward the waves of freedom. The waves were, in fact, taking us to freedom of the ocean. There was a strong current that pulled me about 15 feet out it seemed. I was so fortunate to be next to my bigger friend. I was so unfortunate to have constantly made self-gay jokes toward him and in general. It was a method of appreciation, but due to that everyone takes me for a fool. Anyway, as I was reaching for his hand after requesting for help, he hesitated and considered pushing me away. I was lucky he decided to help me get to shore. Awesome, I'm safe. I'll live. But as I was swimming toward the shore, I heard a familiar voice in the distance. Fuyuki, it's my other cousin and his brother yelling for help about 15 feet away at my 7 o'clock direction if I'm facing the shore. For the split second I hesitated. I'm not a strong swimmer. I was most likely going to die if I tried to help. I didn't even know how I would save them, but, alas, I swam out to them anyway. After all, what would Super Jesus Goku Man do? I grabbed Cousin 2's hand and we grabbed Cousin 3's hand and pushed our way toward the shore. We made it 10 maybe 20 feet, but the current seemed too strong. There was water everywhere and I started to think we weren't going to make it. I'm self-diagnosed depressed with a side of low self-esteem, and it just hit that I didn't really matter, but they did. So, in a final effort I tried to push them both forward with all my might. Dumbest idea ever. The current just took me and I helped it. But then, something grabbed my hands. My two cousins saved me this time and we all made it to shore. Everyone was fine and we laughed about it today. Turns out while we were dying and waving for help, the girlfriends just waved back at us. A couple of years ago I am traveling around Japan. I stopped for a few days in Tokyo and am living in a hostel. The social living area was pretty busy with people coming and going, so it was a cool spot to hang out and make new friends. On one particular afternoon I was sitting on my phone texting/talking, via WhatsApp, to this air host that I had met on the flight out. She came from New Zealand, but stayed in Dubai. We hit it off on the flight and had stayed in touch with a view to us meeting up later in my trip. Anyway, halfway through talking to her and waiting for her replies I start talking to this man next to me. He seemed pretty cool, so we were shooting it. The air host had previously told me her twin brother was also traveling around Asia, but as it's a big place I thought nothing else about it. Anyway, I asked the man where he was from and he said, New Zealand. I sort of laughed and said that I was talking to a girl from New Zealand. He asked where and I said, North Island, somewhere near Auckland. He asked her age and I said, 25 or 26. He replied, same as me, maybe I know her. At this point, the conversation moved elsewhere, and I continued to talk to her on WhatsApp. Anyway, after a few more minutes I mentioned her name and he was like, is her surname redacted? I said yes and he asked where she was from exactly. I asked her and she said Glendower. He was like, holy stuff, that's my twin sister. So, it turns out that I was sitting in a random hostel in Tokyo speaking to a random girl and random guy and they were twin siblings. After we confirmed it was definitely her, we got a selfie together and sent it to her. She also freaked out. What a coincidence. Successful conclusion. We hooked up a few weeks later and had a brief fling. We still stay in touch though and plan to meet up again soon. Family trip from Texas to Colorado with my dad, stepmom, and 2 older brothers. I was around 11 at the time. We drove pretty much straight through, and it was an altogether uneventful journey. We pulled into the lodge, cabinet, rustic trailer homey park place and all climbed out of the van. My dad is sorting out our reservations while my brothers and I are standing around. I spotted a chipmunk about 20 yards away. I picked up a rock and threw it at the chipmunk. It hits it square in the head and kills it almost instantly. My brothers and I flipped it out because my dad would have been really upset. I tossed the chipmunk into the woods, and we never told my dad. I feel bad for killing a chipmunk, but that shot was 1 in a million. When I was in high school we had UIL scholastic competitions. You'd go against kids from nearby schools, then move up to state and maybe nationals. I was in a number of categories, including modern oratory. We got like 5 topics to pick from and had to memorize a 5 to 7 minute speech, no notes or anything. So, I prepare, I have everything perfect, I'm in front of the judges rocking and rolling, and there is a huge boom, and the power goes out. I look to them for guidance, and they say to keep going. Cool, can do. I finished and went out and my coach who was listening enough to tell when I was speaking tells me I'm 5 seconds under the required time. WTF, no, I have this perfect, except I forgot a paragraph. We find out an hour or so later that a squirrel had crawled inside a transformer and busted it or made it explode or something. Later in the evening results are posted and I've tied for first place, only because of the deduction for being under the time requirements. So, basically a squirrel suicide cost me a gold medal. Rumor has gone around my city that this girl was on Bumble talking to a guy, arranging a date. She's like 23, they've been getting really close by text. A few days before the big date he admits it's not him in the photos and the reason is because he is too known by the public/celebrity. Can't remember the correct wording. Anyway, she's really dubious but she's dying to know who it is, so she goes on the date. They are meeting at a restaurant, she's all dolled up and when she walks in, who does she see sitting there? One of my country's most infamous ex-prime ministers, nearly in his 70s at this stage. In high school but over the summer, carful of friends and I decided to do some exploring in abandoned buildings on the western edge of our county. We grew up in a mid-sized Midwest city, so this means we're on backroads through fields and woods, very dark, very secluded, but not far from a fairly sizable population. We drove around to some old buildings, including a former tuberculosis hospital, which is like, totally haunted. Guys, I know someone that saw a ghost in there once. He went to another school though, so you don't know him. You know, typical 16-year-old unruly behavior, just looking for excuses to stay out late and feel dangerous without being actually dangerous or anything. There is an old, abandoned church not far from us. The legend is that it was a regular country church, then they all vanished one day. Like, hymn books open to the same pages sitting on the pews, straight up mass apparat. Or, alternate story, it now houses a satanic cult. Either way, it's a large old, falling down wooden church with an imposing steeple set far back in the woods off a narrow dirt road. We're all alone, everything is overgrown and it's 2 a.m.
So, creepy as balls, basically. We go out and do some exploring. Everything is chained up tight and we aren't the kind of kids to break windows trying to get in. I and another guy head back to the car while two others try to jimmy the locks. We can see them at the front and a tiny bit around the side, and my friend makes a joke about axe murderers in the woods. And I see the shadow of someone else walking around from the side of the church, directly to the front where my friends are still shaking the lock. I'm debating jumping out to get to them or jumping into the driver's seat to drive away, and my other friend is hyperventilating. The shadow comes up to the friends and starts chatting. Turned out to be a man selling drugs, and this was where he'd meet up with people. Luckily, he wasn't too bothered by us since we weren't police officers, and we left him alone in the woods to sell drugs at the abandoned and decrepit church. Pretty innocuous now, but it was one of the most adrenaline-filled moments of my life to that point. Living in a Canadian city, I was driving down the freeway and a guy in an old minivan cut in front of me. He then opens his window and waves at me frenetically. I figure he is trying to apologize and think nothing else of it. Then I look a bit closer at his van and it is full of junk, up to the ceiling, and I think this guy must be a hoarder, and how can he see out of any of his windows? Just then, he sticks his arm out the window again, and he is holding a full-size regulation football, waving it at me. I'm like, what? He then puts his arm back in the van and about 10 seconds later, sticks his arm back out and is now waving a kid's gun. It was a unicolor red plastic obvious toy gun. After waving it at me for about 10 seconds he brings it back in the van, then waves at me frenetically one more time. I follow him for another minute or two and then he exits the freeway. I am totally bewildered by this experience, and think this guy is just a crackpot, and then it dawns on me, my license plate is CFL 187. How did this guy pull that off? Is this his thing? So many questions, I don't think I'll ever fully understand. I worked at Hershey Park when I was a teenager and as such would get to go into the theme park for free, whenever I wanted. One of my friends there told me that some of the band members for Blink-182 were out and about in the park since they played a concert there that night. Being bored and wanting to meet the band, we drove in and started looking out for people wearing backstage passes and the sort. Eventually we found two guys wearing these badges, but we didn't recognize them. Started talking to them and it turned out they were roadies for The Used, who were opening for Blink-182. Went on a few rides with these guys and was hanging out with them for about an hour or two. Cool dudes. Eventually they had to leave but we followed them next door to where the concert was taking place. The one guy told us to hold on and he'd be right back. On his way back he smiled and whipped out 2 free tickets to the concert. We were stoked. I was about to get his number to hang out after the show, but we didn't have much time until it started so we thanked him and went our way. The tickets he gave us were not for general admission but for the lawn. Determined to get close we scuffed up our tickets where it showed the seating area and had people leaving the GA area lick their hand stamps that were exclusive to the GA area and transfer them on our hands. We told the ticket taker our tickets fell on the most pit and they let us in. Free tickets and now we were up front. The Used is getting prepared to come on stage and we see the one ready we were talking to. We waved to him, and he said what's up, very cool. Didn't see the other guy, figured maybe he was the sound guy or something. The Used finally takes the stage and sure the other man we were hanging out with was Jep, the bass guitarist from The Used. He noticed us and I think gave us the sign of the horns and we lost it. So awesome. And to think we were just hanging out with him a few hours before that. Jep, if you're reading this, that was an awesome thing you did that day. Such a crazy and unforgettable experience. Now I'm 33 and reminiscing on all the other crazy stuff I did. So, when my friend and I were around 12 we started walking to our local convenience store which was a little over a half-mile each way. We get there, buy our drinks and start heading back to my house. To this day I don't know if this had anything to do with it, But my friend takes his yellow Gatorade and starts spraying some out of the tip and saying, "Look, I'm passing everywhere," while holding it in front of his crotch. I didn't think anything of it and laughed it off. Well, we are on a sidewalk that runs along the top of these driveways for 4 houses. Right as we are about to pass the 4th driveway, this car swerved into it, almost running us over. 3 guys around 18 hop out and the driver starts walking up to us and says, "What's up, man?" and punched my friend straight in the nose. He falls back with blood pouring down his shirt and bolts in the opposite direction faster than I've ever seen him move. So there I am, staring at this guy as he approaches me. Next, I reach into my pocket and pull out my dad's boot knife that I totally wasn't supposed to be carrying, but thankfully it was enough. I couldn't believe I was about to have to stab someone, but I also knew I couldn't take 3 grown-ass 18-year-olds. The main guy sees I'm waiting for his attack, looks at the knife and hops back into the car with his cronies. The car goes in reverse and starts coming at me fast. I turned and ran and sloppily jumped over the neighbor across the street's fence and landed flat. It backed across the street and hit the brakes just before smashing the fence, with me laying on the ground on the other side staring at the muffler of his car, before taking off. I found my friend a bit later in the woods. His nose was in trouble, and he was worried his dad would never let him go anywhere again, so I gave him my shirt to clean up with and we went back to my place to get him some clothes. Never found out who those guys were or why they jumped on us. Neither of us said anything because we liked roaming the area and didn't want to get into trouble. My father may or may not have cut the power to a nuclear storage facility in Germany during the Cold War. He didn't tell this story for years because it happened only 3 months before his term was up, and he was afraid he'd get court-martialed. While he was stationed in Germany, he often got guard duty up in a tower. Note, this was before the Berlin Wall fell, so tensions in Germany between the Americans and Soviets were at an all-time high. The problem? The storage facility was incredibly old. In fact, it was scheduled to be torn down in a few years as soon as its replacement was built. The tower's heater didn't work, and as it was winter, it would get incredibly cold up there. There was also truly little to do up there. Since they were supposed to be on watch, they weren't allowed to read a book or anything, but there would be nothing to do for 6 hours straight. He said for fun, he would often count the wild hares that he'd see hopping around outside. So, my father, being a self-made handy person, decided that since he didn't have anything better to do, he would try to fix the heater. Despite official requests, nobody had bothered to hire anyone to fix it, so Dad thought he was doing himself and future guardsmen a favor. He said part of the issue of why the heater wouldn't work had to do with the old, haphazard wiring. He spotted a problem, fixed it, but accidentally crossed 2 wires that shouldn't have been crossed. The power in the tower went out. He froze and put the wires where they were supposed to be. Power in the tower came back on, the heater worked, and he felt relieved. Until 30 seconds later, when the tower's phone rang. Once again, this is the late 70s, early 80s, so cell phones weren't a thing. To check with guards, commanding officers or interior guards would have to call the tower. But outside of shift changes, this never happened. Unless something bad was going down. My father picked up the phone, and to his horror, the guard on the other side of the phone said that power to half of the base went out, and to stay on high alert. His heart sank, but wisely, he said yes sir, and didn't say anything about the heater. Remember, this was during the Cold War. A power outage, particularly over the barracks, could mean some sort of Soviet sabotage, spies, or an upcoming attack. This was a nuclear storage facility for crying aloud. The Americans woke up a German electrician in the middle of the night, promised to pay him handsomely, and had him examine the system. After 2 hours of problem solving, the electrician said he had never seen anything like it and chalked it up to an old electrical system. While the electrician was problem solving, every single soldier that wasn't on guard was forced to wake up and stand outside in formation in the snow. My father said that standing in the heated tower and watching them made him feel absolutely terrible. Because they never figured out what had happened, my father never got in trouble. He only told one of his closest friends and my mother for decades, until he finally calmed down about it. but yes. He tried to fix a heater, and inadvertently had an entire nuclear storage facility base to go on standby for a Russian attack. Me and my mother went downtown, and we took the bus. As soon as we got out of the bus, this man ran across the street but misjudged the taxicab and he was hit. The cab must have been driving at around 50 miles per hour and came to a screeching halt as the man hit and broke his windshield. The man flew up in the air and landed on the back of his head. As we were leaving the scene, a few women started to bawl up in shock. The cab driver got out of his car in disbelief. At the time, you'd need to go to a phone booth to call 911 and luckily they were everywhere. The last thing I remember was the man sat up and we saw the back of his head crushed and covered in blood. I will never forget that incident. I always wonder what happened to the man. How about the time I got stabbed in Afghanistan? Nothing, there I was. In Afghanistan on a mountain when this man comes running at me with a knife. He was stabbing down with it from overhead, so I threw my hand up to try and catch his arm, but he jerked at the last second and I ended up holding the knife with the blade. Turns out you're not supposed to grab knives by the blade, but hey, in for a penny in for a pound. So, I squeeze down as hard as I can and pull it out of his hands. Once the situation was under control I realize I'm bleeding pretty bad, look down at my hand and see bone through the slice in my index finger. I turn to my sergeant and say, "Hey, I got to go to the hospital." And start applying direct manual pressure like a good little boy. Skipping ahead, I had to get a few surgeries to reattach the tendons. They even put artificial nerves in to replace the ones that died, so now I am officially a cyborg. And thanks to the new lines they had to cut to reach the damaged areas, the scar is now shaped like my initials. I need to confess to a crime. When I was 6 years old, my cousin and I broke into a house. It was the summer before first grade, 1992, maybe 93, and I spent most days at my cousin Brian's house. My aunt didn't work and so she babysat me, which really was just Brian and me running around the neighborhood causing a ruckus and being home in time for lunch. The rumor around the neighborhood was that this two-story house on the end of the block was empty, but the second floor was full of toys. All you had to do was break into the house and go get the toys. According to legend, there were Ninja Turtles, He-Man figures, G.I. Joes, Stretch Armstrongs, everything. One morning, Brian and I decided we were going to do it. We were going to be the kids who got the toys. We packed some sandwiches and juice jugs into a backpack, drew a map of the neighborhood, put on all black clothing, even though it was broad daylight, and walked down to the house at the end of the block. On our way to the toy house, this other little kid, I don't remember his name, was riding his bike in the alley and asked what we were doing. We told him the plan. He said though, that if we went to that house he was going to tell his mom, and she was going to call the police officers. We brushed him off and kept on walking. Brian and I got to the house and snuck up to the back door. It was unlocked. We opened the door and slowly crept inside into an empty kitchen. All the lights were off, there was no furniture in the dining room, and it looked abandoned. We found the stairs that led to the second floor and walked up. We couldn't believe what we found, boxes and boxes full of toys. It was all true. The legend was real. There was G.I. Joes. There was Ninja Turtles. There were even a bunch of Barbies, but we left those alone. And we immediately began ripping into these boxes and shoving what we wanted to keep in the backpack with the sandwiches. Here's the thing, as an adult, I realized that these people were moving. And we, two little 6-year-olds, broke into their house. As we were cataloging and playing, Brian looked out the window and a police car pulled up to the front of the house. We dropped everything, ran downstairs to the back door and sprinted down the alley back to my aunt's house. We hid under Brian's bed for the rest of the day. And then we realized we left the backpack at the house. When I was a teenager, I went to the county fair. They had a ride that was just a giant roller coaster loop, and the coaster would just rock back and forth until it gained enough momentum to go all the way around the loop. It would also just stop at the very top, before coming back down. It would do that for a minute or so before ending. This was before I had any sense of self-preservation and decided I wanted to ride it. So, I get on the ride, and some stranger gets on next to me, and I wait for the attendant to come around to help me buckle in. He didn't. He went and turned on the ride. I was not belted in, I could not find the belt to lock myself in, and the coaster car had no doors. It had a roof, but no sides. Those were the longest 2 minutes of my life. Terrified, I clung to the inside of that coaster and spread out my arms and legs and pressing up against every surface I could to keep myself in place. The feeling of dread slowly creeping in as the coaster kept rolling closer and closer to the top to be upside down was the absolute most intense fear I've ever felt in my life. I was positive I was going to die, and that it was just a matter of when. While driving to work one morning, I decided to take a different route. The highway was always packed, and I had left early to give myself time to see if this new route would actually be the remedy to my morning traffic woes. I went down a back street a mile off of the highway. I had been cruising down this road for about 5 minutes and didn't see another car. I started thinking how genius I was and wondering why I hadn't done this before when I noticed a horse on the road that was ridden by a man in a cowboy hat. I slowed down once I got closer and waited for the man to steer the horse out of the road. He wouldn't. In fact, he kept steering the horse directly in front of me. Then I saw that in his other hand he had an enormous lasso. He had begun spinning it and rotating it in the air. He flung the lasso at car. He was trying to rope my car. I lived in the city, so this was unheard of. I was late for work that day. Backstory: I lived in a small flat in Eastern Europe, had to sleep with my mom on one bed in the living room. My father has been an alcoholic for as long as I can remember. He got fired from work when I was like 9, and every night he would come home and do random stuff. Parents got separated shortly after this happened. So, this happened in 2006, I was 10 at the time. It was a summer night, and I came back home after spending the entire day playing football with my friends. It was around 10 p.m. so since I was a kid I went to sleep. Before I managed to fall asleep my alcoholic father came home drunk as usual. He started playing random music on his phone and screaming like a madman. I, being a curious kid, got out of bed to see what was going on. I found my parents having an argument about him coming home late. Not noticing me in the room, dear old dad decided to pull his ding-dong out and started passing on the floor. Seeing this, Mom got furious and threatened to call the police. He said something to himself and left, probably to drink even more. Later that night I was woken up by him slamming the door. He must have thought it'd be a great idea to stick his dick into the VCR. Decent DVD players were really expensive in Eastern Europe at the time, and started passing into the cassette slot. The sound of the V-card getting filled up by urine woke up my mother, who went absolutely berserk and kicked Dad out, taking his keys. I was too tired to remember anything else at the moment, but he didn't return home for over a week. At least Mom bought a DVD player soon after. In the early 90s I was on vacation in Tampa, Florida with my, now ex-wife and my toddler son. We were visiting the Salvador Dali Art Museum, which is right on the bay, but my son wasn't impressed and was crying to get down and run around, which wasn't cool in a place like that. So, I took him outside to let him vent a bit. We were walking towards the water's edge when I looked up and saw a small private plane flying really low towards the airport, which was off to the left in the distance. The plane kept going lower and lower, and I remember thinking, what's the plan, dude? It looks like you're going to land on the water. Right then, to my amazement, the plane hits the water in a huge splash and immediately sinks up to wing level. In almost an instant the pilot pops up out of the water and holds on to the wing as if he had practiced this stunt 100 times. Me and a few others just stood there in amazement at what we were seeing. It turns out the pilot had a history of bad piloting, and this time he flew without enough fuel. The newspapers later reported that the FAA revoked his license. In 2009 I was quarantined in China on a school trip because 12 of us got swine flu. We were headed on a bus to our next destination in Hunan province when we were pulled over by who I assume were government employees, and they boarded the bus and proceeded to take everyone's temperature. The few who had a fever were taken to a hospital for treatment. I was taken a few days later when they performed a check in the dorms we were staying in. My temperature was elevated, and I was whisked away in an ambulance with one other student. I was promised by a teacher who spoke full Mandarin that he would meet us at the hospital to sort things out. The hospital was under construction and lost power multiple times throughout the day and night. 12 of us were there getting chest x-rays and blood tests, and my dad was on my case every day about looking at the tools they were using and making sure they were sealed, clean, etc. We were also fed food through little doggy doors and the showers did not work, so I slept in my own filth for about a week. The rest of our crew got to fly home on time, but the Chinese government would not let the rest of us back to the States without medical clearance. We made CNN national news in Britain and America, and our local paper called us the 12 Apostles. When we were all cleared, we got put up in an extremely fancy hotel before we flew back home. I guess they felt bad for all they put us through. Still got to see the Great Wall though. One time, when we were much younger and before we were married, my wife and I decided to play with a Ouija board. I was skeptical, and a lot of the time, I felt like one of us was moving it subtly. It supposedly told us that there was a demon named MG in her house, which was living in the laundry room. I didn't think much of it until it spelled this PROTECTHER. As soon as the lens hit the R, the dryer went off. There were no clothes in the dryer. If it wasn't apparent, the dryer is located in the laundry room. LOL, do I think it was real? I did at the time, but no, not really anymore. A part of me still does though. I think someone just nudged it or something when they reached over it to grab something from the cabinets above it. Still though, crazy as hell.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.